Echo 7.
His boots were positioned as if he had just stepped out of them. The search coordinator noticed it immediately. 4 hours after Harold Mitchell walked into the Olympic rainforest for the 11th time, his boots sat beside a creek crossing with the laces still loosened, ready to step back into, waiting for feet that would never return. Nobody could explain it. This is Echo 7. I have spent 4 years investigating a pattern that should not exist. A pattern that connects 347 wilderness disappearances across American national parks. A pattern that investigators do not track. A pattern that the agencies managing 85 million acres of public land have never acknowledged. 84% of the people who vanish in wilderness areas had been to that exact location before. Not the park, not the trail system, the specific spot where they disappeared. I found this number by accident. I was analyzing terrain features, weather patterns, geographic clusters, looking for anything that might explain why certain people vanish without trace, while others walk the same trails for decades. Then I checked prior visit history, and everything changed. Whatever is happening in these wilderness areas, it happens to people who come back. 13 cases follow. I selected them because their documentation was strongest, because multiple sources confirmed what happened, because the evidence cannot be dismissed. By the time you reach case 13, you will understand why I stopped sleeping. October 1997, Olympic National Park, Washington. I drove to the Graves Creek trailhead on a Tuesday morning in September of last year, more than 2 decades after Harold Mitchell disappeared from this drainage. The Forest Service road was rougher than I expected. Potholes that bottomed out my suspension, branches scraping both sides of the vehicle. It felt like the road was discouraging visitors. The trailhead was empty when I arrived. One other vehicle in the lot, a pickup with Washington plates and a kayak rack. No one in sight. I wanted to see the terrain, to understand what Harold Mitchell had experienced during 11 previous trips to this drainage. To stand where he had stood before, he stopped standing anywhere at all. Harold Mitchell was 63 years old when he vanished. Retired mechanical engineer from Tacoma. His wife filed the missing person report on October 18, 1997, after he failed to return from a 3-day solo backpacking trip on the Graves Creek Trail. Mitchell had hiked the Olympics since 1966. His trail journals, which his wife shared with me after considerable hesitation, documented over 400 trips across the park. The Graves Creek corridor specifically appeared in his records 11 times over 8 years. He knew this drainage the way a commuter knows their daily route. Every creek crossing, every campsite, every section that flooded in heavy rain. He was not lost. Men with 400 documented trips do not get lost on trails they have walked 11 times. Rangers located his truck at the trailhead on October 19th. Search teams found his gear 4 miles in, at a creek crossing that appeared in his journal 6 times across previous visits. His pack was propped against a log. His water filter was assembled by the creek. His trekking poles leaned against a cedar tree. His boots sat beside a flat rock where his map was spread out. The arrangement was meticulous, not the scattered gear of a medical emergency, not the abandoned equipment of a wildlife attack, the deliberate placement of a man who expected to return for his belongings. Dogs followed his scent from that position, 70 yards south, through old-growth forest, to the creek bank. The trail stopped at the water. The creek at that point runs about 15 feet wide over rounded stones. Depth varies from 6 inches to 2 feet, depending on recent rainfall. Water temperature in October runs around 42 degrees. I stood at that creek crossing last September. The water was cold. I dipped my hand and felt the chill of glacial runoff from the peaks above. The creek bottom was visible bank to bank. Every stone, every leaf, every shadow on the gravel. There was nowhere for a person to go. Dive teams searched downstream to the Quinault River confluence over 4 days. Ground teams covered a 10-mile radius from the last known position. 11 days total search time. 212 personnel. No trace found. No clothing. No remains. No equipment beyond what was found at the creek crossing. Harold Mitchell walked to that water, and then was not anywhere the search could find. The search coordinator, a 20-year veteran of Olympic National Park operations, told me it was one of the most comprehensive efforts he had overseen. He walked the creek himself during the search. He stood where the trail had gone cold. He looked at water shallow enough to see the bottom perfectly. There was nowhere for a person to go, and yet the person was gone. Mitchell was never found. His wife gave me access to his journals, standard hiking logs mostly, mileage, weather, wildlife sightings, the kind of meticulous documentation an engineer would maintain over 3 decades of wilderness travel. One entry stood out. October 1994. Same creek crossing. 3 years before he vanished. Mitchell wrote that he cut his lunch break short because the spot felt wrong. He used that word. Wrong. No elaboration. No description of what felt wrong. Just the notation and the decision to pack up and continue 3 miles to his planned camp. I asked his wife if he had ever mentioned anything unusual about previous trips to Graves Creek. She told me he had not. When I asked about hesitation regarding the 1997 trip, she described him as looking forward to it. Same route he always enjoyed. But he had felt something there in '94, something wrong enough to make him leave early. And 3 years later, he returned to the same creek crossing. He did not leave early that time. He did not leave at all. I walked the trail to that creek crossing. 4 miles through old-growth forest that felt older than any forest I had walked before. Western red cedars with trunks wide enough to park a car inside. Hemlock trees rising 200 feet toward a canopy that filtered the light into green cathedral dimness. The air tasted different there, heavy and damp and ancient, like the forest was exhaling something it had been holding for centuries. I found the creek crossing. The water flowed over rounded stones, clear enough to see every detail of the bottom. I stood approximately where Harold Mitchell's gear had been found. I looked at the forest and the creek and the mountains beyond. I did not feel watched. I did not experience the wrongness Mitchell had described. But I noticed something. The bird sounds I had heard on the trail stopped when I reached the creek crossing. Not suddenly. They faded as I approached and were silent by the time I stood at the water. When I walked back toward the trail, the birds resumed. I do not know what this means. Birds go silent for many reasons. A passing raptor, a change in weather, random variation in behavior. The silence might have no connection to what happened there, but I noticed it, and I documented it, because noticing and documenting is what I do. August 2003, Yosemite National Park, California. Cameron Hartley was 29 years old, a climbing guide from Bishop who had been scaling Yosemite walls since age 15. His girlfriend reported him overdue on August 21st after he failed to return from a solo climb on higher Cathedral Rock. Yosemite holds a particular place in the history of unexplained disappearances. In 1981, a 14-year-old girl named Stacy Aris vanished from the Sunrise High Sierra camp while on a guided horseback trip with her father. She walked approximately 100 feet from the group to photograph a lake. She was seen standing at the water's edge by multiple witnesses. She was never seen again. The search for Stacy Aris was extensive. Helicopters, ground teams, dog units. The terrain was searched for weeks. Nothing was ever found. No clothing, no equipment, no remains. A teenager walked to a lake in broad daylight with witnesses watching and disappeared completely. Her father spent years searching. He returned to the area countless times. He never found any trace of his daughter. The Stacy Aris case shares evidence signatures with the cases in my database. A body of water. Witnesses confirming the victim's presence moments before vanishing. Comprehensive searches finding nothing. The pattern was there in 1981, decades before I started collecting data. Cameron Hartley knew the Stacy Aris case. Every Yosemite climber knows it. The park's history includes disappearances that climbers discuss around campfires, cases that feel different from ordinary accidents. Cameron had mentioned the Aris case to his father once, years before his own disappearance. He found it unsettling that a person could vanish so completely in terrain that was well-traveled and well-known. Then he vanished the same way. Hartley's planned route was a moderate technical climb he had completed at least twice before. His vehicle was located in the parking area. His climbing pack was found at the base of the formation, rope still coiled inside. His harness and climbing shoes were laid out on a flat rock, as if he had been preparing to climb, and stopped. Not abandoned during a climb. Stopped before the climb began. Search teams found additional gear 300 yards into the forest north of the wall. His approach shoes rested at the base of a tree. His chalk bag hung from a low branch. His crash pad leaned against the trunk. The arrangement suggested he had walked from the climbing base into the forest and left his gear at specific points along the way. Like markers, like a trail someone might follow. Dogs followed his scent from the tree, with the crash pad approximately 120 yards deeper into the forest. The trail ended at a small seasonal creek, dry that time of year. Just a depression in the ground with damp soil and leaf debris. Even without water, the trail vanished. The creek bed was dry, but something about that location stopped the track as completely as the deepest lake. Technical rescue teams searched every route on the formation. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the approach zone and surrounding forest. 9 days. No trace found. Hartley was never found. His father drove from Bishop to Yosemite every weekend for 6 months after the search ended. He parked in the same lot where his son's car had been found. He walked the approach trail to the climbing formation. He walked into the forest where Cameron's gear had been scattered. He found nothing the search teams had missed, but he told me something that stayed with him. Cameron had climbed that specific route in August 2002, exactly 1 year before his disappearance. During the pre-dawn approach, Cameron mentioned seeing someone in the forest. A figure standing still among the trees, not responding when Cameron called out. Cameron dismissed it as another early morning climber. Climbers often start before dawn to complete routes before afternoon heat. A person standing in the forest was not unusual, but the figure had not moved, had not responded, had simply stood among the trees as Cameron passed. Same forest, same approach. 1 year later, his gear was found scattered through those trees like he was marking a path. I visited the Yosemite Approach Forest in July. Different from Olympic, drier, more open, old-growth fir and pine rather than temperate rainforest. The light fell differently, filtered through needles rather than broad leaves. I found the tree where Cameron Hartley's crash pad had been leaning. Search flagging from years earlier still clung to branches, faded orange against dark bark. The Forest Service does not remove flagging. It remains until weather takes it. The forest felt ordinary. Climbers passed on the approach trail, heading for the walls. Rangers on patrol nodded as they walked past. A normal summer day in Yosemite. But when I walked to the location where the trail had gone cold, approximately 120 yards deeper into the forest, the ordinary feeling changed. Nothing specific happened. No visual phenomenon. No sound that did not belong. Just a shift in quality. The air felt thicker. The shadows seemed to have more substance. I found myself looking over my shoulder without knowing why. I stayed for approximately 10 minutes, taking photographs and GPS readings. Then I walked out. The ordinary feeling returned as soon as I was back on the main trail. I cannot separate my expectations from the location's properties. I knew this was a disappearance site. I expected to feel something unusual. My expectations might have generated the experience rather than reflecting anything inherent to the location. But Cameron Hartley did not expect anything unusual during his 2003 approach. He was focused on his climb, and something was standing in that forest watching him pass. Something that did not respond when he called out. 1 year later, his climbing shoes were on a rock at the base. His gear was scattered through the trees. His trail vanished where a creek bed lay dry and empty. He never reached the wall, just like Stacy Aris never returned from photographing a lake. Yosemite keeps its secrets. May 2005. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. Denise Crawford was 44 years old, a botanist from Asheville who specialized in medicinal plants of the southern Appalachians. Her husband reported her missing on May 21st after she failed to return from a 4-day research trip. The Smokies have more documented disappearances per square mile than any national park east of the Mississippi. The terrain is disorienting. The vegetation is dense. The drainages twist and double back on themselves. Search coordinators describe the park as a landscape designed to hide people. This is where Dennis Martin disappeared in 1969. A 6-year-old boy who walked away from his family during a camping trip at Spence Field and was never found, despite one of the largest search operations in park history. Over 1,400 people searched for Dennis. Green Berets were brought in. Helicopters flew for weeks. The FBI investigated. Nothing was ever found. Not a shoe. Not a thread of clothing. Not a bone. The Dennis Martin case established patterns that I now recognize across my entire database. His scent was tracked by dogs to a creek. The trail ended at the water. Searchers covered the downstream terrain extensively. They found nothing. A 6-year-old boy walked to a creek and then was not anywhere the search could find. Witnesses reported something else that day. A family hiking the Appalachian Trail near Spence Field reported seeing a rough-looking man carrying something over his shoulder, moving through dense vegetation parallel to the trail. They reported this to park rangers during the search. The sighting was investigated. Nothing came of it. The figure was never identified. The connection to Dennis Martin's disappearance was never established, but the detail stayed in the case file. Someone or something was moving through the forest that day, carrying something, avoiding the trail. Denise Crawford disappeared from a drainage approximately 8 miles from Spence Field. The terrain was similar. The vegetation was similar. The evidence pattern was nearly identical. She had been conducting field research in the Smokies for 12 years. Her destination was a remote drainage where she had documented a population of a rare orchid species since 1993. She had visited the site at least 8 times previously. This was not unfamiliar territory. This was her research site, her professional domain, the place where her name would appear in botanical journals for decades to come. Her colleagues at the university described her as meticulous. She documented everything. She followed protocols. She communicated her plans and checked in regularly. She was not the type to take unnecessary risks or deviate from established routines. She had filed a trip plan with the Park Service indicating her destination and expected return date. She had given her husband her route and her camp locations. She had done everything right. Search teams located her camp 6 miles from the trailhead. Tent properly pitched. Food bag hung correctly in a tree, protected from bears. Research equipment arranged beside the stream with the precision of a scientist who expected to return to her work. Her field notebook was open to an entry dated May 19th, documenting healthy plants and good bloom conditions. Her hiking sandals lay inside the tent entrance, straps unbuckled as if she had slipped them off casually. The search coordinator assembled teams within hours of the missing person report. Ground crews entered the drainage from 3 directions. Dog teams were deployed to the camp and surrounding terrain. Helicopter crews flew grid patterns overhead. Dogs followed her scent from the camp approximately 200 yards upstream to a shallow pool. The trail stopped at the water's edge. The pool measured about 3 feet across and 8 inches deep at its deepest point. Clear water over gravel substrate. You could see every pebble on the bottom. Dennis Martin's scent had ended at water 36 years earlier, 8 miles away. The pattern persisted. The search coordinator told me this pool was the most frustrating termination point he had encountered in his career. 8 inches of water. You could not hide a cat in that pool. But her trail ended there, and she was not there, and she was not anywhere downstream or upstream or on either bank. He sent dogs upstream for half a mile. He sent dogs downstream for 2 miles. He had handlers walk both banks looking for any place where scent might pick up again. Nothing. He brought in a second dog team from a different state. They worked the same terrain and got the same results. The trail died at the pool. No pickup anywhere. He checked the pool himself. He waded in and stood in the center, water barely reaching his ankles. He looked at the stream bed and the banks and the forest beyond. There was nowhere for a person to go. 14-day search. 173 personnel. Multiple dog teams. Helicopter support with thermal imaging. Ground crews covering every drainage within 5 miles of the camp. No trace found. Just like Dennis Martin. Just like dozens of others in these mountains. Crawford was never found. Her husband maintained her research files for 15 years after she vanished. Her specimen collections remained in storage at the university where she had taught. Her field notebooks lined a shelf in his home office. The orchid population she had been studying went undocumented after her disappearance. No other botanist continued her research. The species she had discovered and monitored for 12 years still blooms every May in that remote drainage. Unseen by anyone who understands its significance, I read through her field notebooks. 12 years of meticulous scientific observation, plant counts, bloom dates, weather conditions, soil samples, the kind of documentation that builds careers and advances knowledge. One entry from 2002 stood out. She heard an unusual sound from upstream, something like a voice, though she could not identify words. She walked toward the sound and found nothing. No person, no animal, no mechanism that would explain what she had heard. She noted that she felt unsettled afterward and left the drainage earlier than planned. In a notebook full of objective scientific observations, this entry contained emotion. She used the word unsettled. She recorded that she left early. This is significant. Scientists document what they observe. They maintain objectivity. They do not typically include emotional states in field notes unless those states are relevant to the research. Denise Crawford felt strongly enough about her experience to deviate from her documentation standards. The sensation mattered enough to record. 3 years later, her trail died at a pool of water barely deep enough to reach a child's knees, the same way Dennis Martin's trail ended 36 years earlier. The Smokies continue taking people the same way they always have. Approximately 2 years after she disappeared, her husband visited the drainage. The need to see the place had become overwhelming, to understand what she had experienced there, to look at the pool where her trail had ended. The hike-in was beautiful, he told me. Green forest alive with spring growth, birds calling from the canopy, streams running clear over rounded stones. Now he understood why his wife had loved this place enough to return for 12 years. The drainage matched her field notes exactly. The stream, the orchid habitat, the overhanging canopy that filtered the light. The orchids were blooming where she had documented them, and there was the pool. Standing at its edge, he looked at water so shallow he could count the stones on the bottom. No sense of being watched. No strangeness like she had described. The forest seemed ordinary, peaceful, but something unsettled him. Fresh tracks in the mud at the water's edge, boot prints, and among them, partially obscured but visible, what appeared to be a bare footprint. The toes clearly defined, too large to be his wife's. Someone else had been to this pool recently. Someone who had removed their shoes at the water's edge. Hikers occasionally passed through the drainage, though it was remote. Someone could have stopped at the pool and waded in to cool their feet. That was the rational explanation. But the bare print unsettled him. The echo of what his wife might have done. The suggestion that others were drawn to stand at this water and remove their footwear. No photograph. No report to anyone except me, years later. A long moment looking at that print, and then he walked out of the drainage. Never went back. September 2006, North Cascades National Park, Washington. Mitchell Reynolds was 51 years old, a wildlife photographer from Bellingham whose work appeared in National Geographic, Audubon, and multiple scientific publications. His wife alerted park authorities on September 10th, after his satellite messenger stopped transmitting. Reynolds had been photographing mountain goats in the North Cascades for 22 years. His destination was a basin where he had documented a specific herd since 1984. He estimated he had visited the basin at least 40 times. 40 visits to the same location. A thief would have taken it. A person planning to disappear would have sold it first. A medical emergency would have left the person near the equipment, not 150 yards away at the lakeshore. The equipment stayed. The person left. Dogs followed his scent from the camp approximately 150 yards to the lakeshore. The trail ended at the water. The lake measured approximately 62 feet at its deepest point. Water temperature around 38 degrees. Dive teams searched the entire lake bed over 3 days. Nothing. 8 days. 73 searchers. Helicopters circling the basin until fuel ran low. The lake kept whatever it took. Against standard protocol, the search coordinator allowed his wife to accompany the initial teams into the basin. Decades of photography trips with Mitchell had taught her how to move in backcountry without disturbing evidence. At the lake shore where the trail had gone cold, she stood looking at water reflecting peaks and sky. Mitchell had photographed this view hundreds of times. Albums full of images from this exact spot. Different. The lake looked different to her that morning. Same blue-green color, same mountain backdrop, same glacial stillness, but different. A long time at the water's edge. Long enough that the search coordinator checked on her. Just looking, she told him. Not just looking. Listening. Waiting for the lake to reveal something. To show her what Mitchell had seen. To explain what had happened. Nothing revealed. That evening she left the basin. Never returned. Mitchell was not there anymore, she told me. Walked to the edge of that water and gone somewhere she could not follow. What did she mean by that? No explanation possible. Only the knowledge that standing at that shore, the absence of her husband felt different from grief. Not missing. Gone. Completely gone from the world she could perceive. Dozens of times in that basin with Mitchell. Watching him photograph the lake in every kind of light. Knowing the place as well as he did. Something had changed. The place itself, or her perception of it. Impossible to tell which. I visited the basin in late July. The lake was beautiful in a way that photographs do not capture. The water reflected peaks and sky with such clarity that the reflection seemed more real than the reality. Alpine meadows ran down to the shore, bright with wildflowers in the late summer sun. I understood why Mitchell Reynolds had returned 40 times over 22 years. The place was magnificent. I walked to the lake shore where the dogs had lost his trail. I looked at water that ranged from turquoise in the shallows to deep blue at the center. I felt nothing unusual. The location seemed peaceful. Wind moved across the water and created small waves that caught the light. Marmots whistled from the talus slopes above, but I did not approach the water closely. I stayed several feet back from the edge. Something made me reluctant to stand exactly where Mitchell had stood. I do not know if that reluctance reflected something real or my own psychological state. I was at a location where someone had vanished. Some reluctance was probably inevitable. What I can tell you is that the reluctance was there, and I listened to it. His wife shared something else with me. Mitchell had mentioned the lake feeling different during a visit in 2004. He had been photographing the goat herd as usual when the animals suddenly moved away from the water. All of them. At the same moment. As if responding to something he could not perceive. He noted it in his field journal. Unusual herd behavior. No apparent cause. He stayed to photograph the phenomenon, then packed up earlier than planned. 2 years later, he returned, and the lake took him. July 2008. Glacier National Park, Montana. Patricia Warren was 68 years old. Retired mathematics professor from Bozeman, who had been visiting Glacier every summer since 1972. Her husband alerted Park Service on July 15th after she failed to return from what should have been a day hike. 36 years of summer visits, the same park, often the same trails, often the same lakes and peaks and overlooks. Warren specialized in a lake approximately 6 miles from the trailhead, a glacial tarn tucked beneath a cirque wall, accessible by a steep but well-maintained trail. She had photographed the lake in every month from May through October over 3 decades. Her collection documented the lake through drought and flood, through early thaws and late freezes, through clear days and storm light. She had been to that specific lake at least 20 times. Her camp was found 2 miles from the lake, at a site she had used on previous trips. Her pack was propped against a rock. Her stove and cooking gear were arranged as if she had been preparing dinner. Her camera was inside the pack, lens cap on, memory card containing images from earlier that day. Her trail runners sat neatly paired outside the tent. toes pointing toward the lake as if she had set them down before walking that direction. Dogs followed her scent from the camp to the lakeshore. The trail ended at the water's edge. The lake measured approximately 300 feet across at its widest point. Maximum depth, 47 feet. Water temperature in July, around 44 degrees. Clear enough to see the bottom in the shallows. Search teams covered the lake and surrounding terrain for 11 days. Dive teams searched the lakebed twice. The water gave up nothing. Patricia Warren joined the list of people who walked to that lake and did not walk back. Her daughter investigated the disappearance for 3 years after the official search ended. She filed records requests for every document related to the case. She interviewed rangers and searchers. She walked the trails her mother had walked. The records requests revealed something the public reports had not mentioned. 2 other people had disappeared from within 1 mile of that same lake over the previous 15 years. Different trails, different access points, but the same lake at the center of the disappearance zone. The Park Service had not connected the cases. Different years, different circumstances, different databases. But when the daughter mapped the disappearances, the pattern was clear. 3 people vanishing within 1 mile of the same lake over 15 years. She brought this to the attention of investigators. They acknowledged the clustering, but could not explain it. The terrain around the lake was not particularly hazardous. The trail was well maintained. There were no hidden cliffs, no fast water, no features that would predictably produce fatalities. The clustering was noted in her mother's file, and no action was taken. She found the journals. 36 years of park visits documented in careful handwriting. Weather conditions, trail notes, wildlife sightings. The kind of meticulous documentation a mathematician would maintain. One entry from 2004 mentioned feeling uneasy at the lake. The notation was brief, just that she had felt uneasy and had almost turned around before reaching the shore. She did not turn around. She completed the hike, but she left the following day, 1 day earlier than planned. 4 years later, her trail died at that same lakeshore. The daughter visited the lake herself, alone, approximately 1 year after her mother's disappearance. She stood at the water where the trail had gone cold. She felt pulled. That was how she described it. A pull toward the water. A desire to wade in, to keep walking until the cold closed over her head. The sensation was not rational. It was not grief, though grief was present. She stepped back from the shore. She did not wade in, but she understood then why her mother had returned to that lake year after year, despite the unease she felt there. Something about the place drew people back. Something that was not entirely comfortable, but was compelling anyway. She told me the pull frightened her, not because it was strong, but because it felt right. It felt like the obvious thing to do, to walk into the water and keep walking. She has not returned to Glacier since. March 2010, Canyonlands National Park, Utah. Robert Sullivan was 47 years old, professional geologist from Salt Lake City who consulted on mining operations throughout the Southwest. He specialized in sandstone formations and had been studying the canyon systems of southern Utah since graduate school. His wife reported him missing on March 18th after his satellite beacon stopped transmitting from a location approximately 5 miles into the backcountry. Sullivan had been visiting this section of Canyonlands for 16 years. He estimated he had made approximately 50 trips into the maze of canyons and mesas, documenting formations, collecting samples, mapping geological features that interested him. His camp was found on an outcrop overlooking a confluence of canyons. Tent pitched in his usual spot. Geological equipment arranged beside his work area. Sample bags labeled and organized. Field notebook open to observations from the previous day. His field boots rested on their sides beneath his camp chair, as if kicked off casually. His wool socks were folded inside them. Search dogs could not work the terrain. The sandstone was too technical, the exposure too dangerous for animals. Rangers relied on visual search and thermal imaging instead. Footprints in the sand led from the camp to an overlook approximately 200 yards away. The prints stopped at the rim. No return tracks. The drop from the rim was approximately 400 feet, vertical to slightly overhanging sandstone. Technical rescue teams rappelled to the canyon floor and searched the base of the wall. Nothing. If he had fallen, his body would have been at the base of the wall. 400 feet of freefall onto sandstone. The remains would have been visible. The rescue teams found nothing. Ground teams covered the canyon system in expanding grids. Helicopter crews flew every drainage. 12 days of searching produced nothing but questions. The desert swallowed Robert Sullivan the way it has swallowed others before him. His field notebooks contained 23 years of geological observations from sites across the American West. Most entries were technical: rock compositions, fault lines, erosion patterns. One entry from 2007 mentioned something different. He was working on an outcrop that overlooked a side canyon when he noticed a pattern in the sandstone face across from his position. The pattern suggested a face: eyes, nose, mouth suggested by erosion and shadow. Pareidolia, he wrote. The brain finding faces where no faces exist. But he noted that the face seemed to be watching him. He noted that he felt uncomfortable giving it his back while he worked. He noted that he finished his observations quickly and descended to a different elevation before continuing. He returned to that outcrop at least 5 more times before his disappearance. He continued his research. He continued documenting formations and collecting samples. Whatever he felt during the 2007 visit did not stop him from coming back. His equipment was found arranged at his usual work site, his boots beside his vest. The formation with the face would have been directly in his line of sight as he worked. I visited the Canyonlands outcrop in October. The terrain required technical access. I hired a guide who knew the route and had the equipment for the descent. The outcrop overlooked the canyon system, a stunning view of layered rock extending to distant horizons. The formation Robert Sullivan had described was visible from the work site where his equipment had been found. I looked at the sandstone face, the pattern he had noted in his journal. Eyes, nose, mouth suggested by erosion and shadow. The pattern was there. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The face seemed to watch the work site with an expression I could not read. I did not feel observed. The formation felt like rock, ancient and weathered and inert, but I found myself reluctant to turn my back to it. I kept positioning so the face was in my peripheral vision, even when examining other formations. I was not comfortable giving it my back. The guide noticed, asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. We completed the work and descended. I did not feel comfortable until we were below the outcrop sightline. November 2011. Denali National Park, Alaska. Kevin Reeves was 39 years old, a mountaineer from Anchorage who had been climbing in the Alaska Range since college. He had summited Denali twice and had attempted several technical routes on surrounding peaks. His climbing partner reported him missing on November 20th, after Kevin failed to return to their high camp from a reconnaissance of a potential summit route. Reeves had been on this specific mountain 11 times over 15 years. He knew the terrain, the weather patterns, the crevasse fields. He had led clients up lower routes and had pushed harder lines with experienced partners. This was not unfamiliar territory. His equipment was found at the high camp. Pack organized, crampons cleaned, ice tools ready for the next day's climb. His satellite phone was inside the tent, battery full. His boots were beside his sleeping pad. His boots were beside his sleeping pad. In a high camp on a technical mountain in Alaska. In November. Nobody removes their boots at high camp in Alaska in November. The temperature drops to 40 below. The wind strips heat from exposed skin in seconds. You sleep in your boots to prevent frostbite. Every mountaineer knows this. Kevin Reeves had summited Denali twice. He knew the cold. He knew what it does to exposed flesh. His boots were beside his sleeping pad. The search lasted 8 days before weather forced suspension. Conditions in November in the Alaska Range are brutal. Wind speeds that make flight dangerous. Temperatures that limit ground teams to short exposure windows. Visibility that changes minute to minute. Teams covered the route Kevin had been scouting. They checked crevasse fields, rappelling into openings wide enough to swallow a person. They checked avalanche runouts where debris might have carried a body. They checked every location where a mountaineer might come to harm. Nothing. No tracks beyond the established route. No equipment. No sign that Kevin had left the camp except for the fact that he was not there. The Alaska Range does not return what it takes. Kevin Reeves became another name on a long list of climbers who walked into those mountains and became part of them. The search coordinator described the case as one of the most puzzling he had encountered in Alaska. People die in the Alaska Range every year. They fall into crevasses. They are caught in avalanches. They succumb to exposure. Their bodies are recovered, sometimes immediately, sometimes years later when glacial movement brings remains to the surface. But they leave evidence. They leave tracks. They leave signs of their passing. Kevin Reeves left nothing. He walked out of his tent at 17,000 feet and disappeared. The only conclusion that fit the evidence was that he had walked away from camp barefoot in conditions that would produce fatal hypothermia within minutes. But no body was found. No tracks led away from the tent. The snow was undisturbed. His climbing partner told me Kevin had mentioned something strange during a trip 2 years earlier. They were at the same high camp, preparing for a different summit attempt. Kevin said the mountain felt different. Not the weather, not the conditions. The mountain itself felt different on this visit compared to previous visits. He laughed when he spoke, but his partner recalled that the laugh sounded forced, as if Kevin recognized his observation as strange, but felt compelled to voice it anyway. The partner asked what he meant by different. Kevin could not explain. He described it as a quality, a presence, as if the mountain was paying attention to them in a way it had not during previous climbs. They completed that climb successfully. Kevin came home, but the partner told me Kevin changed after that trip. He still climbed. He still pushed hard routes, but he talked less about the mountains themselves. He talked about routes and conditions and logistics. He did not talk about what the mountains felt like. 2 years later, he walked out of his tent at high camp without boots and did not leave tracks in the snow. June 2013. Anza Borrego Desert State Park, California. Sandra Powell was 54 years old, amateur astronomer from San Diego who had been photographing the night sky from remote locations for 18 years. Her husband reported her missing on June 22nd after she failed to return from a weekend trip to a site she had been visiting annually since 1995. 18 years of annual visits, same location, same purpose, documenting the night sky from a pullout on a desert road that offered unobstructed views and minimal light pollution. Her astronomical records were extensive, hundreds of photographs documenting meteor showers, planetary conjunctions, lunar eclipses. She had captured images that had been published in amateur astronomy magazines. She knew the night sky the way some people know their neighborhoods. Her vehicle was found at the pullout. Her telescope was set up on a flat rock with a view of the eastern horizon. Her camera was attached to the telescope mount, powered on, memory card containing images from the previous night. The images on the memory card showed star trails and constellations. Normal astrophotography. The last image was time-stamped at 2:17 in the morning. Her boots were beside the telescope tripod. The arrangement suggested she had been photographing, removed her boots for comfort as she often did during long observation sessions, and then walked away from her equipment. Dogs followed her scent from the pullout approximately 300 yards into the desert scrub. The trail ended at a dry wash. No water, just sand and gravel and scattered stones. This is significant. In most of my cases, trails end at water. Sandra Powell's trail ended at a dry wash, a place where water would flow during rare desert rains, but was empty at the time of her disappearance. The absence of water did not change the pattern. The trail still vanished. The person was still gone. The mechanism remained unexplained. Ground teams searched the surrounding area for 9 days. The desert revealed nothing. Sandra Powell walked into the darkness she had been photographing for 18 years. The stars she loved still wheel overhead at that pullout, but no one is there to document them. Her husband told me Sandra had documented an unusual phenomenon during a visit in 1995. Lights moving across the desert floor, that did not correspond to any known source. Not aircraft, not vehicles, not atmospheric phenomena she could identify. She photographed the lights. The images were inconclusive, points of illumination against a dark background that could have been almost anything. Light pollution from a distant source, reflections from vehicle headlights miles away, natural bioluminescence that occasionally occurs in desert environments. But Sandra was an experienced astrophotographer. She knew how to distinguish between astronomical phenomena and terrestrial light sources. She knew how to read the sky and the landscape beneath it. She told her husband the lights were moving, not drifting like reflections would drift, moving with apparent purpose, traveling across the desert floor as if looking for something. He asked if she was frightened. She told him she was fascinated. She had kept returning. 18 years of annual visits to the same observation point, watching the same stretch of dark desert sky. Her husband believed she was hoping to see the lights again, to understand what she had witnessed, to document it properly this time. She never mentioned the lights after that initial observation, but she kept coming back. Whatever she had seen in 1995, it drew her back, and eventually, something at that location took her. August 2014, Mount Rainier National Park, Washington. Thomas Henderson was 62 years old, retired minister from Seattle who had been hiking in the Cascades since seminary. His daughter reported him missing on August 23rd after he failed to return from a 5-day solo backpack trip. Henderson had spent his career leading congregations in the Pacific Northwest. He was known for sermons that drew connections between natural landscapes and spiritual truths. He believed that wilderness was a place where the divine became visible. Mountains and forests and rivers were not just terrain. They were evidence of something larger. He had walked this particular loop 6 times over 12 years, a 50-mile route through alpine meadows and old-growth forest, crossing several watersheds and offering views of Rainier from multiple angles. The route was challenging, but not technical. Appropriate for an experienced backpacker in good health. His congregation members described him as cautious and methodical. He prepared thoroughly for trips. He carried appropriate gear. He communicated his plans. He was not the type to take unnecessary risks. His camp was found at a site beside a creek he had used on at least 3 previous trips. Tent properly pitched with guy lines staked at proper angles. Food hung from a bare wire at regulation height. His stove and cooking supplies arranged beside a flat rock that served as a kitchen. His Bible was open on his sleeping pad, marked at a passage from Psalms. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. His worn leather hiking boots lay on the tent floor beside the sleeping pad, soles facing up as if he had rolled over and pulled them off before standing. Dogs followed his scent from the camp approximately 100 yards to the creek. The trail ended at a crossing point where the water ran ankle-deep over smooth stones. The creek was not a barrier. A child could have waded across it, but his trail ended there and did not continue on the other side. 11 days, 87 searchers, ground crews, dog teams, helicopters, technical specialists checking every cliff and ravine. The wilderness Thomas Henderson had loved for 40 years didn't give him back. His daughter shared his hiking journals with me, standard trip logs with one addition that most hikers do not include. Thomas wrote brief prayers at each campsite, thanks for safe travel, requests for guidance, acknowledgments of beauty witnessed. The prayers were intimate, personal conversations with something he believed was listening. They revealed a man who approached wilderness as sacred space. One entry from 2011 mentioned something different. He was at the creek crossing that would later become his last known position. He wrote that he felt a presence there, something watching from across the water. He did not describe the presence as threatening. He did not describe fear. He wrote that he felt small, observed, as if something vast had noticed his passing. He prayed for understanding and felt the presence withdraw. But he also wrote that he would return to that creek. He wanted to understand what he had encountered. He wanted to know if the presence would reveal itself again. 3 years later, his trail ended at that same crossing. His daughter told me her father had spent his life trying to understand the divine. He had studied theology. He had counseled people through crises of faith. He had preached about the relationship between the finite and the infinite. He believed that wilderness was a place where boundaries thinned, where the ordinary world touched something else. He had spent 40 years seeking that contact. She believed his faith compelled him to return to the creek, to confront what he had encountered, to seek understanding of forces that existed outside his religious framework. Thomas was not the type to flee from difficult experiences. He was the type to engage them. He engaged whatever he felt at that creek until his final visit. His daughter asked me what I thought had happened to her father. I told her the truth. I do not know. I can document the pattern. I cannot explain the mechanism. She told me she believed her father had found what he was looking for, the presence across the water, the contact he had spent his life seeking. She believed he had stepped across some threshold into something he understood better than anyone else could. I cannot evaluate beliefs like this. I can only record them. October 2015, Zion National Park, Utah. Rachel Stevens was 31 years old, wildlife biologist from Flagstaff who studied mountain lion populations across the Colorado Plateau. Her supervisor reported her missing on October 19th after she failed to check in from a field research location. Stevens had been conducting research in this section of Zion for 4 years. Her work involved setting camera traps, collecting scat samples, and occasionally tracking individual lions through their territories. She was comfortable in lion country. She understood predator behavior. She carried appropriate equipment and followed safety protocols. Her colleagues described her as fearless but not reckless. She respected the animals she studied. She understood that apex predators are dangerous. She took precautions and followed protocols. She had been tracking a specific male lion through this canyon system for 2 seasons. She knew his territory, his patterns, his preferences. The camera trap data she had collected would contribute to understanding lion movement across the Colorado Plateau. Her field camp was found in a side canyon approximately 3 miles from the nearest trail. Tent pitched at a site she had used multiple times. Camera trap equipment organized beside her pack. GPS unit powered on, battery at 60%. Her lightweight field boots were tucked just inside the tent flap. Ankles collapsed inward as if they had been gently set down rather than kicked off. The search coordinator described the scene as orderly. No indication of wildlife attack. No sign of struggle or disturbance. Her equipment suggested she had been preparing for another day of field work and then simply walked away. Dogs followed her scent from the camp approximately 400 yards through the canyon to a pool of standing water at the base of a pour-off. The trail ended at the pool. The pool measured approximately 10 feet across and 3 feet deep at center. Clear water over sandstone. Every detail of the bottom visible. A pool that could not conceal a body. Search teams covered the canyon system for 13 days. They checked every side canyon, every alcove, every slot that might contain a person. Technical rescue teams accessed terrain beyond standard search protocols. The canyon kept Rachel Stevens the way it keeps the lions she studied. Silent, hidden, gone. Her field notes documented predator activity throughout the area. Lion scat, deer kills, territorial markings, standard research observations recorded in precise scientific language. One entry from April 2015 mentioned that she had sensed a presence while setting a camera trap. She dismissed the sensation as typical hypervigilance from working around large predators. She had felt eyes on her in forests hundreds of times. The sensation usually meant nothing, but she noted that this time felt different. The quality of the observation was different, as if whatever was watching was not a lion. She wrote that the sensation persisted, even after she completed her work and left the area. She felt observed during her entire hike back to camp. She felt observed while cooking dinner and preparing for sleep. The sensation faded sometime during the night. She returned to the same area the following day and felt nothing. The watching was gone. The canyon felt normal. 5 months later, she returned to the same canyon and vanished. Her supervisor told me Rachel had mentioned the watching sensation during a phone call shortly before her disappearance. She described it as a professional curiosity. Something was observing her in the field, and she wanted to understand what. She speculated that a lion was tracking her. Lions do observe potential prey. They watch and evaluate before deciding whether to engage. The sensation of being watched in lion country was not unusual, but she also acknowledged that the quality of the observation felt wrong. Not like a predator evaluating prey. More like something assessing her for purposes she could not identify. Her supervisor asked if she felt safe continuing the research. Rachel laughed and told her she had been working around predators for years. A strange feeling was not going to stop her from doing her job. 5 months later, her trail died at a pool of standing water in the canyon, where she had sensed that presence. January 2016. Death Valley National Park, California. Douglas Mercer was 44 years old. Canyoneering guide from Las Vegas who had been exploring technical slots and drainages throughout the Southwest for 22 years. His wife reported him missing on January 15th after his satellite beacon stopped transmitting. Mercer was considered one of the most experienced canyoneers in the Southwest. He had descended hundreds of canyons across Utah, Arizona, and California. He had written route descriptions that appeared in guidebooks. He had trained dozens of people in technical descent techniques. He had descended this particular canyon at least 4 times previously. A technical slot requiring multiple rappels and down climbs, accessible only to experienced canyoneers with proper equipment. He was working on a photographic documentation of the route for a guidebook he was writing. The canyon was beautiful in the way the Death Valley canyons are beautiful. Narrow passages carved through ancient rock. Light filtering down from above in shifting patterns. Colors that changed with the angle of the sun. His equipment was found at a ledge approximately 2/3 of the way through the canyon. Rope still rigged for the next rappel. Camera attached to his harness. Headlamp on a rock beside his pack. His canyoneering shoes were placed at the edge of the ledge, side by side, toes pointing toward the next drop. The placement was deliberate. The shoes were aligned perfectly. Toes at the edge, as if marking the exact point where the next rappel would begin. Search dogs could not access the terrain. The canyon was too technical for standard tracking. Technical rescue crews rappelled to the ledge and searched the canyon below. They found nothing. The canyon continued through narrow passages and over waterfalls for another half-mile before opening into a broader drainage. They searched every section, every alcove, every pool. 15 days. Nothing. Douglas Mercer descended into that canyon for the 5th time and never ascended. His wife told me Douglas had mentioned a strange experience during a 2015 descent of the same canyon. He had forgotten the sequence for a section he had completed 3 times before. He sat on a ledge for 20 minutes, reviewing his notes before continuing. This was unlike him. Douglas had an exceptional memory for route details. He could describe descents he had done years earlier with precise accuracy. Forgetting a sequence he had completed 3 times was anomalous. He told his wife the canyon felt wrong that day. Not dangerous, not threatening. Wrong. As if the walls were leaning in to look at him, as if the canyon was paying attention. Memory lapse is not typically considered a precursor to disappearance. People forget things, especially in demanding technical environments where attention is split across multiple concerns. But his gear was found at that same ledge 1 year later. The exact ledge where he had sat for 20 minutes trying to remember the sequence. He had descended to that point and stopped. His shoes were placed at the edge of the next drop as if he expected to put them back on, as if he planned to continue the descent after a brief interruption. September 2016. Olympic National Park, Washington. Lynn Anderson was 49 years old, backpacking guide from Port Angeles who had been leading trips in the Olympics for 18 years. Her climbing partner reported her missing on September 22nd. After she failed to return from a solo trip to a lake she had visited annually since 1998. Anderson knew the Olympics better than most rangers. She had walked every major trail in the park at least twice. She had led clients through terrain that challenged experienced backpackers. She had encountered wildlife, weather, and trail conditions that would have turned back less experienced hikers. The lake she was visiting was a personal favorite, a destination she returned to every September for nearly 2 decades. 18 years of annual visits to the same body of water. She had told her climbing partner that the lake was where she went to reset, a place where the accumulated stress of guiding seasons dissolved into the sound of water and wind, a place that felt like home. Her camp was found at a site she had used on every previous visit, tent pitched in her usual spot, pack organized with the precision of someone who had packed thousands of times. Her trail journal was inside, open to entries from the current trip. Her well-worn Danner boots sat just outside the tent vestibule, positioned side by side with the care of someone who valued her gear. The laces were loosened, but still threaded through every eyelet. The entries documented a normal trip, good weather, clear trails, wildlife sightings including a black bear crossing a meadow at distance. Nothing unusual. Dogs followed her scent from the camp to the lake shore. The trail ended at the water's edge. The lake was small, approximately 200 feet across, maximum depth 18 feet, cold and clear and surrounded by old-growth forest. A lake that had drawn Lynn Anderson back for 18 years, 12 days. Dive teams searched the lake twice, ground crews, helicopters, technical teams on every cliff face. The lake that had been her sanctuary for 18 years became her final destination. Her climbing partner told me Lynn had mentioned that the lake looked different during a visit the previous year. She could not explain what she meant. The same water, the same trees, the same view she had photographed for 17 years. But something about the way it looked had changed. She used the word altered. The lake looked altered, as if someone had adjusted a setting that changed everything without changing anything specific. She mentioned it once, and never brought it up again. But she returned the following September, despite noticing something different, despite whatever alteration she had perceived. Her climbing partner asked her why she kept going back if the lake felt wrong. Lynn told her that wrong was not quite the right word. The lake felt more real, somehow, more present, as if it had woken up after years of sleeping. She found that compelling rather than frightening. 1 year later, her trail vanished at the shore of that same lake. October 2017. Joshua Tree National Park, California. Alan Crawford was 57 years old, retired park ranger from 29 Palms, who had worked at Joshua Tree for 23 years before retirement. He knew the park better than almost anyone alive. 23 years of walking those trails, 23 years of learning the terrain, the weather patterns, the wildlife behavior, the subtle changes that seasons bring to desert landscapes. He had been there during droughts and floods. He had seen fires and recovery. He had watched the park change and stay the same. After retirement, he continued walking. The trails were part of his life. The desert was his home. He had spent more time in Joshua Tree than most people spend in any single location. His wife reported him missing on October 20th after he failed to return from an afternoon walk he had taken thousands of times. Thousands. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands of walks on the same trails over decades. He knew every rock, every Joshua Tree, every turn in the path. His vehicle was found at a pullout near the Skull Rock Formation. His day pack was leaning against a Joshua Tree approximately 1 mile from the parking area. His water bottle was beside the pack, half full. His boots were placed at the base of the Joshua Tree. The arrangement was deliberate. Boots side by side. Pack propped against the trunk. Water bottle within reach, as if he planned to return for them after a brief walk. Dogs tracked him from the tree approximately 200 yards into flat desert terrain. The trail ended without explanation. No water, no terrain feature, nothing that would cause a tracking dog to lose the trail. The desert floor was flat. Visibility extended for miles. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to disappear. 10 days. Grid searches across square miles of open desert. Helicopters, infrared at night. The desert Alan Crawford had protected for 23 years did not protect him back. It took him the way it has taken others. Silently, completely, without explanation. His wife told me Alan had mentioned sensing something during walks in the park, not during his career as a ranger, after retirement, when he walked the trails as a visitor rather than as an employee. "The desert knows I am here," he told her. "I still feel it sometimes when I walk the trails." She asked what he meant. He could not explain. He described it as an awareness, a sense that the landscape was paying attention, that his presence was noted by something he could not identify. He did not find the sensation frightening. He found it familiar. After 23 years in the park, he had come to accept that the desert had qualities that defied explanation. 23 years of walking those trails. And then one evening, he did not walk back. I visited Joshua Tree in late October, approximately 1 year after Alan Crawford disappeared. The formation near where his gear was found is called Skull Rock, a well-known destination. Tourists photograph it constantly. Families pose in front of it. The name comes from the skull-like appearance of weathered granite, 2 dark eye sockets staring from pale stone, a formation that has watched visitors come and go for thousands of years. I walked the trail in late afternoon, the same time Alan Crawford had walked it before his disappearance. The light was golden. The Joshua trees cast long shadows across the desert floor. I found the location where his pack had been found, leaning against a Joshua tree beside the trail. I found the spot where his boots had been placed. The desert stretched in all directions, open terrain with visibility extending for miles. Nothing to hide behind. Nowhere to conceal yourself. Where did he go? The question felt very present standing there. He was a park ranger for 23 years. He knew this terrain. He walked this trail thousands of times. He knew every rock and tree along the route. He removed his boots and walked into flat open desert, and was never found. I stayed until sunset. I watched the light change across the formations. I felt nothing unusual, no sense of being observed, no presence, no pull toward walking further into the desert. But I noticed that I did not want to walk past the point where his boots had been found. The trail continued. Other hikers passed me, walking toward Skull Rock and beyond. I did not want to follow them. A ranger stopped to ask if I needed assistance. I told him I was researching a disappearance. He nodded slowly. He knew the case. He had worked here when Alan Crawford was still a colleague. He told me the desert had changed since Alan disappeared. Something felt different. He could not explain what, but he walked the trails more carefully now. He paid attention to where his feet fell. I turned around and walked back to the visitor center before full dark. The 13 cases I have presented span 20 years and 10 parks. The circumstances vary. Mountains and deserts, forests and canyons, technical terrain and easy trails. But the pattern holds. Every case involves a return visitor, someone who had been to that exact location before their final visit, someone who had walked that specific trail, camped at that specific site, stood at that specific spot. The prior visit counts range from 4 to 40. Some people returned for years. Some returned for decades. The number of prior visits does not predict when disappearance occurs, but the existence of prior visits is consistent across cases. 84% of wilderness disappearances in my database involve return visitors. This correlation demands explanation. It suggests that something about prior visits changes the nature of subsequent visits, that the first trip to a location carries different risk than the second or third or 20th trip. The experiences reported during prior visits suggest a mechanism. People noticed things at these locations before they vanished. They felt watched. They heard sounds. They saw phenomena. They experienced wrongness. These experiences may have been the beginning of the process that ended in disappearance. The first visit may be when something notices a particular person. The subsequent visits may be the development of whatever relationship or connection leads to vanishing. I do not know if this interpretation is correct. I do not know if the prior experiences were causal or coincidental. I do not know if paying attention to such experiences would prevent disappearance or merely postpone it. But the correlation between prior experiences and subsequent disappearance is too strong to ignore. People who vanish often reported unusual sensations at the disappearance location before their final visit. People who did not vanish but felt similar sensations chose to leave. The choice to leave may be the difference between survival and disappearance. Or the choice may be irrelevant, and some people are simply taken while others are not. The data cannot determine which interpretation is correct, but the data suggests that awareness of the pattern is preferable to ignorance. The search operations for these cases shared common characteristics that investigators found troubling. Standard wilderness search protocol assumes the missing person is somewhere within the search perimeter, that thorough coverage will locate them or their remains, that dogs will track scent, and helicopters will spot color, and eventually, the case will resolve. These assumptions failed consistently across all 13 cases. The failure was not from lack of effort. These were not abbreviated searches cut short by budget or weather. These were comprehensive operations involving dozens or hundreds of personnel, multiple dog teams, helicopter support, dive crews, and technical rescue specialists. The failure was fundamental. The missing persons were not within the search perimeters. They were not anywhere the searches could find. Harold Mitchell's search involved 212 personnel over 11 days. The search coordinator, a 20-year veteran of Olympic National Park operations, described it as one of the most comprehensive efforts he had overseen. Ground teams gridded the forest in 100-meter intervals. Helicopter crews flew the drainages looking for any break in the canopy color that might indicate clothing or equipment. Dive teams searched the creek downstream to its confluence with the larger river system. They brought in search dogs from 3 different agencies. They used thermal imaging. They deployed drones with cameras. They covered every square foot of terrain within the search perimeter multiple times. The creek where Mitchell's trail ended measured approximately 15 feet wide. Average depth 18 inches. Water temperature in the low 40s. The bottom was visible from bank to bank in most sections. You could see every stone. Dive teams checked anyway. They checked every pool, every undercut bank, every log jam that might trap a body. The current was moderate, not strong enough to move a 200-pound man very far. They found nothing. The search coordinator told me the creek crossing bothered him for years afterward. He had been part of hundreds of searches. He had found bodies in places that seemed impossible. He understood how wilderness conceals remains. But this creek offered no concealment. The water was shallow and clear. The banks were visible. The terrain was open old-growth forest without dense undergrowth. He walked there during the search and stood where the trail had gone cold. He looked at the water flowing over stones no deeper than his boot tops. There was nowhere for a person to go. After the search ended, he drove back once alone. He stood at the water again. He looked at the forest and the creek and the mountains beyond. He wanted to understand what he had missed. He did not understand. 20 years of experience told him that people do not vanish without trace in terrain like this. 20 years of experience could not explain what his search had failed to find. The evidence showed Mitchell walked to that water and then stopped being in any location the search could find. Cameron Hartley's father drove from Bishop to Yosemite every weekend for 6 months after the search ended. He parked in the same lot where his son's car had been found. He walked the approach trail to the climbing formation. He walked into the forest where Cameron's gear had been scattered. He found nothing the search teams had missed. No fiber caught on bark. No footprint preserved in soil. No sign that his son had walked beyond the tree where his crash pad had been leaning. The approach shoes were the detail that stayed with him. Side by side, at the base of the tree, toes pointed away from the trunk. As if Cameron had sat down, removed his shoes, placed them carefully, and then walked deeper into the forest barefoot. Why would a climber remove his approach shoes in the forest? Why would he leave his chalk bag hanging from a branch? Why would he walk away from the gear he needed? The father had no answers. He stopped driving to Yosemite after 6 months, not because he had given up, because the forest was starting to affect him in ways he could not explain. He felt watched among those trees. He felt something paying attention. He told me he believed Cameron was still in that forest somehow. Not dead, not alive in any conventional sense. Present, part of whatever lived among those old growth trunks. I do not know what to do with beliefs like that. I record them because families share them with me. I cannot evaluate their accuracy. The prior visit experiences share common elements. Something felt different. Something felt wrong. Something produced unease or discomfort that the person noted, documented, or mentioned to others. The sensations are not identical. Some people felt watched. Some people heard unexplained sounds. Some people saw visual phenomena they could not explain. Some people experienced a quality of wrongness they could not articulate. But the sensations cluster around a common theme. Something about these locations engaged the attention of the people who would later vanish there. Something marked these individuals during prior visits. Something created a connection that drew them back until a final visit occurred from which they did not return. Kevin Reeves laughed when he told his climbing partners that the mountain felt different. The laugh sounded forced, one partner recalled, as if Kevin recognized his observation as strange but felt compelled to voice it anyway. The mountain felt different. Not the weather, not the conditions, not the technical challenge of the route. The mountain itself felt different on this visit compared to previous visits. Kevin had climbed that route 4 times before. He knew the mountain as well as anyone who was not a permanent researcher or guide. He understood its moods, its patterns, its dangers. He had internalized its character through years of repeated experience. When something changes in a landscape, you know intimately. You notice. Kevin noticed. He commented on it. He laughed about it. And then he walked out of his tent in the night without boots or gear and did not leave tracks in the snow. Sandra Powell documented unexplained lights moving across the desert floor and then kept returning to the same observation point year after year. Her husband believed she was hoping to see them again, to understand what she had witnessed. She never mentioned the lights after that initial observation, but she kept coming back. 18 years of annual visits to the same pullout on the same highway to watch the same stretch of dark desert sky. Whatever she had seen, it drew her back, and eventually something at that location took her. Thomas Henderson felt what he described as a presence at a creek crossing and continued returning to that creek for 3 more years. He wrote about the experience once and never mentioned it again, but his hiking patterns showed repeated visits to the same trail, the same crossing, the same spot where he had felt something he could not explain. His daughter believed his faith compelled him to return, to confront what he had encountered, to seek understanding of forces that existed outside his religious framework. Thomas was not the type to flee from difficult experiences. He was the type to engage them. He engaged whatever he felt at that creek until his final visit. Then, he did not come back. Rachel Stevens dismissed her sensation of being observed as typical hypervigilance from working around large predators. She had sensed eyes on her in forests hundreds of times. The sensation meant nothing. 5 months after noting the forest felt different, she returned to the same location and vanished. Maybe the sensation did mean nothing. Maybe her disappearance was unrelated to what she felt during the April visit. Maybe the correlation across cases is coincidental rather than causal. I cannot prove mechanism. I can only show pattern. Douglas Mercer experienced what he called technical uncertainty during a 2015 descent of the canyon, where he would later disappear. He forgot the sequence for a section he had completed 3 times before. He sat on a ledge for 20 minutes reviewing his notes before continuing. Memory lapse is not typically considered a precursor to disappearance. People forget things, especially in demanding technical environments where attention is split across multiple concerns. The observation might have no significance, but his gear was found at that same ledge 1 year later. He had descended to that point and stopped. His canyoneering shoes were placed at the edge of the next drop, as if he expected to put them back on. Lynn Anderson called her partner from the backcountry, saying the lake looked different. She could not explain what she meant. When she got home, she never brought it up again. 1 year later, her trail vanished at the shore of that same lake. Alan Crawford told his wife the desert knew he was there. He laughed when he spoke, but he still felt it sometimes when he walked the trails. The desert watching him. 23 years of walking those trails. Then one evening, He did not walk back. The experiences vary in their specifics: sounds, sensations, visual observations, feelings that defy articulation, but they cluster around a common theme. Something about these locations engaged the attention of the people who would later vanish there. Something marked these individuals during prior visits. Something created a connection that drew them back until a final visit occurred from which they did not return. I do not know what that something is. The evidence does not reveal it. I can describe the pattern without explaining the cause. What I can say is that the pattern deserves attention. 84% of wilderness disappearances in my dataset involve people returning to locations they have visited before. The correlation is too strong to dismiss as coincidence. If you have visited a wilderness area and noticed something unusual about it, if you felt watched, or uneasy, or wrong in a way you could not explain, if you went home and did not mention it because it seemed irrational, you may be part of this pattern. I am not advising you to avoid wilderness entirely. The odds of disappearance remain extremely low for any individual visitor. Millions of people return to favorite wilderness locations every year without incident. But among those who do disappear, the profile is consistent. They had been there before. They often reported unusual experiences during prior visits. They returned anyway. The choice to return is yours. I can only tell you what the data shows. I can connect this pattern to broader documentation of wilderness disappearances. Researchers who have studied unexplained wilderness vanishings have noted consistent elements across cases. Equipment left behind in orderly arrangements. Scent trails ending at water features. Boots removed and placed side by side. Evidence suggesting the missing person walked voluntarily into whatever took them. The Dennis Martin case in the Great Smoky Mountains. The Stacey Aris case in Yosemite. Cases that have generated decades of speculation because the evidence does not fit conventional explanations. The return visitor pattern may be the connection those researchers have been missing. Not where people disappear, not when people disappear, but who disappears. People who have been there before. People who have felt something at that location. People who returned despite what they felt. The pattern does not explain the mechanism. It does not reveal what takes people or where they go, but it provides a profile, a characteristic that distinguishes those who vanish from the millions who do not. 347 out of 412. The first visit is apparently safe. It is the return that carries risk. The agencies that manage wilderness lands do not track prior visits in their missing persons databases. This is a failure of documentation that deserves attention. I filed records requests with the National Park Service, the Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management seeking data on prior visit history for missing persons cases. The responses were consistent. Prior visit history is not a tracked variable. The agencies do not collect this information systematically. Individual case files may contain references to prior visits if investigators happen to ask, or if family members volunteered the information. But there is no checkbox on the intake form, no field in the database, no protocol requiring investigators to determine whether the missing person had been to the disappearance location before. This is a significant gap in documentation. If the pattern I have identified is real, and the evidence suggests it is, then prior visit history should be a standard element of every wilderness disappearance investigation. The response from one agency was particularly telling. They acknowledged receiving my request for aggregate data on prior visits and disappearances. They stated that the information does not exist in a form that can be queried. Each case file is separate. Each database is separate. There is no way to run a search that would return the correlation I was asking about. They were not saying the pattern does not exist. They were saying the infrastructure to detect the pattern does not exist. The data is not collected in a way that would allow anyone to see what I saw. Search coordinators I interviewed acknowledged the gap but expressed skepticism about its significance. Most missing persons cases involve return visitors, they noted. People go missing in places they know. That is normal. Hikers return to favorite trails. Climbers return to familiar routes. Researchers returned to established field sites. The correlation I identified might simply reflect the baseline probability that anyone visiting a wilderness area has been there before. I addressed this objection by calculating the percentage of wilderness visitors who are return visitors versus first-time visitors. The data is incomplete, but permit records and visitor surveys suggest that return visitors constitute approximately 50 to 60% of wilderness area visitors in most parks. If return visitors are 60% of all visitors but 84% of all disappearances, the correlation exceeds baseline probability by a statistically significant margin. Return visitors are overrepresented among the missing. The objection does not hold. Something about prior visits correlates with elevated disappearance risk. The correlation is too strong to dismiss as coincidence. I am not claiming the agencies are hiding anything. I am not suggesting a conspiracy. I am pointing out a gap in data collection that prevents pattern recognition across cases. If prior visit history were tracked systematically, the pattern I identified might have emerged decades earlier. Other patterns might emerge that we cannot currently see. The data infrastructure does not exist to support the analysis. This should change. I have submitted recommendations to the relevant agencies suggesting that prior visit history be added as a standard intake variable for wilderness disappearance investigations. The responses have been polite and non-committal. The system continues as designed. Each disappearance processed individually. Each file entered into its database without cross-reference to files in other databases. The pattern invisible because no one is looking for it. I will continue looking. Someone has to. The boots remain the most disturbing element of the pattern. 11 of 13 cases involve footwear removed and placed side by side before the person vanished. Boots parallel to each other. Laces loosened. Socks sometimes inside, sometimes beside them. Why would 13 people in 10 different parks across 20 years independently decide to remove their boots and arrange them before walking away? Medical emergency does not explain it. People having heart attacks do not pause to organize their footwear. Wildlife encounter does not explain it. No blood, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. Criminal activity does not explain it. Abduction victims do not have time to arrange equipment. Voluntary departure does not explain it. People choosing to disappear do not leave their boots behind and walk barefoot into terrain that would destroy unprotected feet. The boots suggest the missing persons expected to need them again. They were not abandoning equipment. They were setting it aside temporarily. But temporarily for what? Where did they think they were going that did not require footwear? A search coordinator with 27 years' experience told me the boots bothered him more than any other element. Bodies get lost, he said, but people do not remove their boots and place them side by side when they are about to die. He believed the missing persons thought they were going somewhere and coming back. They walked voluntarily into whatever took them, expecting to return. The boots were set aside for the return trip that never happened. What did these people see or experience that made them believe they needed to walk somewhere without boots? What convinced them they would return? What happened when they reached their destination? The evidence does not answer. I interviewed a tracking expert who had worked with search dogs on wilderness disappearance cases. He explained the mechanics. Dogs track scent particles that humans shed continuously. A person walking through terrain leaves a trail that trained dogs can follow for hours or days. Scent trails end when the person stops shedding particles or at barriers like rivers that wash away particles. In the cases I documented, scent trails typically ended at water, shallow creeks, lake shores, pools barely deep enough to cover a person's feet. The tracking expert explained these terminations were unusual. Shallow water should not completely eliminate scent. The person would wade through and emerge on the other side, but the dogs indicated nothing on the other side. They circled the water feature without picking up the trail. The trail ended entirely. His name is Paul Hendricks, 22 years tracking with dogs, over 600 cases, success rate above 90% on trackable terrain. The cases in my database fall outside that 90%. Paul described standing at a creek crossing in the Cascades where a man's scent had ended. The creek was 12 inches deep. Visibility to the bottom was perfect. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why a healthy man would walk to this water and vanish. He told me something he had never told an official investigator. At approximately a third of the water features where scent has ended, he has experienced pressure, a weight in the air, a feeling that the space was occupied by something he could not see. He is not a superstitious man, but he has stood at enough termination points to notice the pattern. 2 other tracking professionals observed similar things. A Southwest tracker described termination points in desert terrain that should not exist. Dry washes where scent ends without water. Rocky outcrops where the trail simply stops. A Great Lakes tracker described one case involving a woman who disappeared from a lake shore in northern Michigan. The lake was approximately 100 yards across. Maximum depth 12 feet. Clear water, sandy bottom. Dogs tracked her scent from her campsite to the water's edge. Dive teams searched the entire lake. Side-scan sonar covered every inch. Nothing. The woman had visited that lake every summer for 9 years. Some people go somewhere the dogs cannot follow. The Great Lakes tracker believes the termination points are connected somehow. Not geographically, but functionally. Different lakes, different states, different years, but the same phenomenon. She does not know what connects them. Paul Hendricks had the most developed theory, though he was reluctant to share it. He believes the water is a threshold, not a physical barrier, but a transition point. The people who disappear at these locations do not drown. They do not hide. They do not run. They cross over. I asked what he meant by cross over. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me that he does not know. He knows only that the evidence shows people entering water and not being in the water afterward, not being anywhere afterward. The physics of tracking cannot explain it. The physics of human bodies cannot explain it. Something happens at these water features that the rules of the physical world do not accommodate. The water is a doorway, he told me, and they walk through it. He has no evidence for this beyond the absence of other explanations. He has no theory about where the doorway leads. He has no understanding of why some people walk through and others do not. But after 22 years of tracking, after standing at dozens of termination points where trails went cold and people vanished, he has arrived at a conclusion he cannot defend scientifically. The missing persons went somewhere, not somewhere he can follow, not somewhere the dogs can track, but somewhere, and the water is how they got there. There is another category of evidence I have not yet discussed. People who experienced something at these locations and did not disappear. People who felt the pull, the wrongness, the sense of being watched, and walked away. I have interviewed 43 of them over the past 2 years. People who contacted me after seeing my earlier work. People who recognized the profile and wanted to share what they had experienced. Their accounts are consistent with each other and with the experiences reported by family members of the missing. The sensations are the same. The locations share characteristics. The timing of the experiences follows patterns. The difference is that they left. These survivors provide data the missing cannot provide. They can describe in detail what they experienced. They can explain the quality of the sensation, the progression of the feeling, the moment when they decided to leave. The first account came from a woman in Portland. I will call her Sarah. After watching one of my earlier videos, she recognized a creek crossing I had described. Solo backpacking in the Olympics, 2012. 15 years of hiking alone. Comfortable in wilderness. Knew how to read terrain, weather, wildlife signs. Not easily frightened. Late afternoon at a creek crossing, filtering water. Approximately 4 miles from any trail junction, deep in old-growth forest that few hikers ever reached. While crouched by the creek, something watching her from across the water. Not an animal, not a person. Something that occupied space but did not have form she could identify. Looking up, the forest across the creek was empty. Trees and ferns and shadows. Nothing there, but the watching continued. pressure at the back of her skull, weight on her attention, similar to being stared at in a crowded room, but magnified, more intense, more focused. What happened next, she told me in careful detail because she had replayed it in her mind for years. Standing up slowly, not crossing the creek, backing away from the water, turning, walking back the way she had come, not running. Running would be wrong somehow, a violation of some rule she did not understand. 3 hours of trail in fading light. Car reached as full darkness fell. Home without telling anyone what had happened. For weeks afterward, questioning the experience. Imagination? Fatigue or dehydration producing false sensations. Isolation of solo backpacking generating paranoid thoughts. The experience could not be dismissed. It remained vivid in a way that hallucinations typically do not. Every detail remembered. The angle of the light, the sound of the water, the exact moment when the watching began. 2 more trips to the Olympics in the following years. Not to that creek. Different trails, different drainages. The third time, approximately 8 months after the creek experience, that watched feeling returned. Different location, but the same sensation. The same pressure, the same weight. No return to the Olympics since. Contact with me, because she recognized the creek crossing from my description. Did the location match coordinates from a disappearance? It did. A man had vanished from within 100 yards of that creek in 2009, 3 years before her experience. Trail ended at the water. What should she do with this information? I told her what I tell everyone. I do not know. I can document the pattern. I cannot explain it. I cannot offer protection strategies beyond awareness. No wilderness area since we spoke. The knowing has changed something for her. The second account came from a man in Denver. I will call him Michael. Wildlife photographer. A lake in Rocky Mountain National Park, visited annually for 12 years. Same lake, same week of summer, same campsite on the North Shore. 2018 visit. The lake felt different. Impossible to explain what different meant. Water looked the same. Peaks reflected the same way. Wildlife patterns normal, but something had changed. The quality of the silence was wrong. Space around him felt compressed, as if the landscape was leaning in to look at him more closely. Being inside something, he described it. Not surrounded by landscape, inside it, as if the mountains and the lake and the sky had become a container, and he was the thing being contained. Photographed the lake as always. Slept at the usual campsite. Did not sleep well. Woke multiple times with the certainty that something was standing outside his tent, waiting. Nothing there when he looked. Campsite empty each time. But the certainty remained. Left a day earlier than planned. Drove home feeling like he had escaped something, though he could not identify what. Returned to the same lake in 2019. The wrongness was stronger. Watched from the moment he reached the trailhead. The watching followed him to the lake and intensified as he approached the shore. No overnight stay. Photographed the lake for approximately an hour and then hiked out. The watching faded during the descent. Normal feeling again by the time he reached his car. No return to that lake since, too. Contact with me because a friend had shared my work and he recognized the pattern. Had others reported similar experiences at that location? My database showed 2 people disappeared from within half a mile of that lake over the previous 15 years. Both return visitors. Both left equipment arranged. Both had trails that ended at water. Michael was shaken by this information. He told me he had been considering one more trip to the lake to prove to himself that his fears were irrational. Now he would not go. The knowing has consequences. The third account came from a retired Forest Service employee. I will call her Diana. She worked in wilderness management for 28 years across 4 western states. She has experienced the watching sensation at multiple locations over her career. She does not dismiss the sensation as imagination. She has felt it too many times in too many places. She has learned to recognize it as a property of certain locations rather than a product of her own psychology. What she told me was different from the other accounts. She believes the watching is not malevolent. She described it as neutral, an awareness, an attention, like the landscape itself is conscious in some limited way and notices certain people who pass through. Most people, she believes, pass through unnoticed. They visit once. They take photographs. They drive home. They are not registered by whatever consciousness exists in these places. But some people are noticed. Something about them triggers recognition. And once they are noticed, they are tracked, remembered, watched on subsequent visits. She compared it to how a predator notices prey. The first glimpse triggers attention. Subsequent sightings intensify interest. Eventually, the predator decides whether to pursue or ignore. She believes most people who are noticed are ultimately ignored. They feel the watching. They feel the wrongness. They leave and do not return. The watching loses interest. But some people are not ignored. Some people are pursued across multiple visits until a final encounter occurs. She does not know what determines the difference. She does not know why some people are taken and others released. She only knows that after 28 years of working in wilderness, she has observed a pattern that official explanations do not accommodate. Certain places are aware. Certain people are noticed. And a small percentage of those noticed do not come home. A fourth account came from a man who requested complete anonymity. He had visited a specific drainage approximately 20 times over 7 years. It was his refuge from ordinary life. During his most recent visit, he experienced something that does not fit into rational categories. He was sitting by a creek when the watching intensified until he felt paralyzed. He saw something in the water. He will not describe what. He told me only that it was aware of him, that it was inviting him into the water, that the invitation felt like the most natural thing in the world. He wanted to walk to the creek. He wanted to step in and keep walking. He described the sensation as complete peace, a resolution to every question he had ever asked. He sat paralyzed for approximately 40 minutes. Then something broke. He ran to his car and drove away without collecting his gear. He has not been back. He will never go back. I have received 3 other reports mentioning a visual component and an invitation to enter the water. All came from people who resisted and escaped. I have received no reports from people who accepted, because those people are not available to report. A 5th account came from a wildlife biologist who has worked in wilderness for 20 years. One drainage stood out. She has worked there 6 times over 8 years. Every visit, she feels watched. Every visit, it feels wrong. She told me something that confirmed a hypothesis I had been developing. The intensity correlates with repeat visits. The first time, the sensation was mild. By her 6th visit, the watching was almost unbearable. She believes repeated visits increase whatever connection is being formed. She continues her research there because her work matters more than her safety. She knows she is taking a risk that increases with each visit. She knows she may eventually become one of the cases in my database. She believes something lives in that drainage, not an animal, something that occupies the space between the trees and notices who enters. She declined to share the location. If people knew that place was associated with unusual experiences, some would visit specifically because of that. Some would investigate, and whatever lives there would notice them. These accounts raise questions that the disappearance cases cannot answer. Why did these people walk away, while 347 others did not? What distinguishes the survivors from the missing? The differences I can identify are subtle. The survivors describe making conscious choices to leave. They recognized that something was wrong, and they responded by extracting themselves from the situation. The missing, according to family accounts, often did not recognize that anything was wrong until the wrongness had become irresistible. They experienced unusual sensations but continued their activities. They noted feeling watched but did not change their behavior. Perhaps the threshold is awareness. Perhaps the people who survive are the ones who pay attention to their instincts and act on them. Or perhaps the difference is arbitrary. Perhaps some people are taken and some are not taken, and the distinction has nothing to do with their behavior. I cannot test this. I can only document what the survivors describe and compare it to what the families of the missing report. The survivors left when they felt wrong. The missing stayed. The families I interviewed shared a range of responses to their losses. Some found closure through faith. Some found it through acceptance. Some continued searching for explanations years or decades after the disappearances. Harold Mitchell's wife had stopped looking for answers. She had accepted that she would never know what happened to her husband at that creek crossing. She described it as a kind of peace, though she acknowledged the peace was incomplete. She still had his hiking journals. She still read them sometimes. She told me that reading them made her feel close to him in a way that nothing else did. 400 trips documented in careful handwriting. Decades of wilderness experience compressed into notebooks that filled a shelf in her closet. He was happiest in those forests, she told me. Whatever happened to him, he was in a place he loved. She kept his hiking boots, the ones he wore on trips before the final one. They sat in the closet beside the door, as if waiting for him to return and put them on. She could not bring herself to move them. Cameron Hartley's father continued developing theories. He corresponded with other families who had lost people in similar circumstances. He collected cases and looked for patterns. He wanted to understand what had taken his son. He had contacted researchers who study unexplained phenomena. He had reached out to people who investigate claims of paranormal activity. He had read everything he could find about wilderness disappearances that defied explanation. He had visited Cameron's favorite climbing areas, not the place where Cameron disappeared. Other places, routes they had climbed together, walls where Cameron had taught him technique. He felt close to his son in those places. None of it gave him answers, but the searching was important to him. He could not accept not knowing. He could not stop trying to understand. He told me that his son was not dead in any way he could comprehend. Cameron was somewhere. The somewhere was inaccessible, unknowable, beyond the reach of search teams and dogs and helicopters. But Cameron was there. He believed this with the certainty of faith. Nothing I could say would change it. I asked him if the belief helped. He told me it was the only thing that helped. Believing that Cameron continued in some form. Believing that the connection between father and son had not been severed, only transformed. He did not expect me to share his belief. He understood that it could not be verified, but he had chosen to believe it because the alternative was unbearable. Patricia Warren's daughter had stopped investigating after 3 years. She had filed every records request. She had interviewed every witness. She had walked every trail her mother had walked. She had hired a private investigator. She had consulted with forensic specialists. She had spent thousands of dollars trying to understand what had happened to her mother. She found no answers, but she found acceptance. Her mother had spent 36 years returning to a lake that made her feel uneasy. The lake had drawn her back despite the unease, and eventually the lake had taken her. The daughter could not explain why her mother kept returning. She could not explain the pull she had felt when she visited the lake herself. She could not explain any of it, but she had stopped needing explanations. Her mother was gone. The how and why did not change that fact. She told me that knowing about the pattern helped her, knowing that her mother fit a profile, knowing that 346 other people shared the same circumstances. The knowing did not bring her mother back, but it removed the burden of thinking something could have been done differently. Her mother had not made a mistake. The risk was in the return itself. She asked me if I thought she would see her mother again someday. I told her I did not know. I told her I could not offer comfort that required certainty I did not possess. She appreciated the honesty. Too many people had offered her false comfort, platitudes about closure, and moving on. She preferred difficult truth to easy lies. The hypotheses that might explain the return visitor pattern fall into several categories. I have spent years evaluating each one. First hypothesis: the pattern is coincidental. Return visitors are overrepresented among wilderness users generally, and the correlation with disappearance reflects this baseline probability rather than any causal relationship. I addressed this hypothesis above. The math doesn't support it. Return visitors are overrepresented among the missing beyond what baseline probability would predict. The correlation is real. Second hypothesis: Return visitors take greater risks because they are comfortable with terrain they have experienced before. Familiarity breeds complacency. They push further, stay longer, attempt routes they would not attempt on a first visit. This hypothesis has merit for some cases. Experienced users do sometimes underestimate risks they have successfully navigated in the past, but it does not explain the evidence patterns. Risk-taking that leads to accidents produces evidence. Bodies, equipment damage, signs of falls or wildlife encounters. The cases in my database lack this evidence. The disappearances are clean, equipment arranged, boots placed, scent ending at water. No indication of what went wrong. If return visitors were disappearing because of overconfidence, we would find remains. We would find evidence of the accidents that killed them. We do not. Third hypothesis. Something at these locations recognizes return visitors and responds differently to them than to first-time visitors. The prior visit creates a connection that makes subsequent visits more dangerous. This hypothesis is consistent with the unusual experiences reported during prior visits. The sensations of being watched, the feelings of wrongness, the visual or auditory phenomena some people documented. But the hypothesis does not specify what creates the connection or how it operates. It is descriptive rather than explanatory. It names the pattern without revealing the mechanism. What would recognize visitors? What would remember them? What would respond differently to someone it had seen before? These questions have no answers in conventional frameworks. The hypothesis requires accepting that something exists in these locations that current understanding does not encompass. I do not dismiss this hypothesis. The evidence is consistent with it, but I cannot endorse it without understanding what we are discussing. Fourth hypothesis. Return visitors have been somehow marked or selected during prior visits, making them vulnerable to whatever takes people from these locations. The prior visit is not just preparation for disappearance, it is recruitment. This hypothesis is darker than the third. It suggests intentionality, purpose, selection criteria that we cannot perceive. The prior experiences reported by families support this hypothesis. The sensations of being observed, the feelings of wrongness. These could be markers, signs that something has noticed a particular individual and begun a process that will culminate in disappearance. But the hypothesis cannot be tested without understanding what does the marking or how vulnerability is created. It raises more questions than it answers. Fifth hypothesis. Some locations in wilderness areas function as thresholds or passages. Return visitors have crossed some invisible boundary during prior visits that ordinary visitors do not cross. The subsequent disappearance is a completion of a process begun earlier. This hypothesis explains why some people require multiple prior visits before disappearing, while others disappear on their second or third visit. The threshold might be individual, varying based on characteristics we cannot measure. It also explains the unusual experiences during prior visits. Those experiences might be the sensation of approaching the threshold. The feeling of wrongness might be proximity to the boundary. But the hypothesis does not explain what the threshold leads to, or why crossing it produces the observed evidence patterns. It describes a structure without filling in the content. I do not endorse any hypothesis over the others. The evidence supports the pattern without revealing the mechanism. The 84% figure tells us what happens without telling us why. What I can offer is guidance based on the pattern. If you have visited a wilderness area and nothing unusual happened, your risk profile on subsequent visits is probably no different from your first visit. The pattern does not suggest that any return visit is dangerous. It suggests that among those who disappear, most were returning. If you have visited a wilderness area and something unusual did happen, if you felt watched, if you experienced unease you could not explain, if the location felt wrong or different in ways you could not articulate, your risk profile may be elevated. I am not saying you will disappear if you return. I am saying that the profile of people who disappear includes unusual experiences during prior visits at rates exceeding coincidence. The choice to return is yours. The information is mine to provide. Pay attention to what you feel in wilderness. Your instincts may be detecting something your conscious mind cannot identify. Evolution built threat detection into our nervous systems for reasons. The unease you feel in certain places may be the residue of ancestral knowledge about dangers that language has not yet named. Or it may be nothing. Fatigue, low blood sugar, unfamiliar terrain, solitude. Many factors can produce unusual feelings without implying any actual threat. I cannot tell you which explanation applies to your experience. I can only tell you what the data shows about people who dismissed their unusual experiences and returned anyway. Some of them are still walking trails and climbing peaks and photographing wildlife. The majority of return visitors come home safely, including many who reported unusual experiences on prior visits. Some of them are not. I visited 5 of the 13 disappearance sites over a 2-year period. I needed to see the terrain, to understand what these people had experienced, to evaluate whether the locations contained anything that might explain the pattern. I have already described the Olympic, Yosemite, North Cascades, Canyonlands, and Joshua Tree sites. Each visit left impressions that are difficult to articulate. The Olympic site felt ancient. The forest seemed to exist in a different time than the rest of the world. The creek crossing where Harold Mitchell vanished was a place where silence accumulated like water in a pool. The Yosemite site felt watchful, not dangerous, not threatening, watchful, as if the forest was paying attention to who walked through it and why. The North Cascades site felt magnetic. I understood why Mitchell Reynolds had returned 40 times. The beauty was compelling in a way that demanded return, and I understood the reluctance I felt at the water's edge. Something about that specific location resisted approach. The Canyonland site felt observed. The face in the sandstone was pareidolia. I know this, but the face watched me work, and I could not give it my back. The Joshua Tree site felt patient. The desert stretched in all directions, open and visible, and somewhere in that openness, Alan Crawford had walked away from his boots and disappeared into flat terrain where nothing could hide. I do not claim these impressions reflect anything real about the locations. They may be artifacts of my expectations. I knew what had happened at each site. I knew the evidence. My mind may have generated experiences consistent with what I expected to feel, but the impressions are what I experienced, and they are consistent with what families described. The watching, the wrongness, the pull toward water or darkness or distance. If my expectations generated these feelings, then perhaps the expectations of the missing persons generated similar feelings during their prior visits. Perhaps the sensations are projections rather than perceptions. But projections of what? What would cause 13 people in 10 parks over 20 years to project the same feelings onto wildly different landscapes? What common source would explain the consistency? The question has no answer. The pattern exists. The mechanism remains hidden. I understand the resistance to this information. I felt it myself when the pattern first emerged. My initial assumption was that I had made a methodological error, that the prior visit correlation reflected bias in my data collection or analysis, that the number would not hold under independent verification. So I hired independent verification, a graduate student in statistics who had no stake in the outcome. She reviewed my methodology, replicated my analysis, and confirmed the results. 84%. The number held. She asked me what I thought it meant. I told her I did not know. She asked what I was going to do with the information. I told her I was going to share it. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she told me to be careful, not because the information was wrong, because it was right. And some truths are dangerous to spread. I asked her what she meant. She told me that people do not want to know this. They do not want to believe that returning to a favorite trail increases risk. They do not want to examine the sensations they felt at a particular location and wonder whether those sensations marked them for something. They will reject the information, she told me, and they will reject the messenger. She was right. Since I began sharing this research, I have received messages calling me a fraud, a sensationalist, a fearmonger. People accuse me of exploiting tragedy for attention. They accuse me of making up data to serve a narrative. I have also received messages from families who lost someone to the pattern. They tell me the information confirms what they suspected. They tell me knowing the pattern exists helps them understand why their loved one vanished. They tell me the worst part was not knowing. And now they know something, even if the something raises more questions than it answers. The pattern is real. The explanation remains unknown. I present these cases not to frighten people away from wilderness. The wilderness is essential. Natural landscapes provide psychological benefits, physical challenges, and connection to something larger than human civilization. I would not discourage people from experiencing them, but I would encourage awareness. Attention to your own reactions in wilderness settings. Recognition that some places produce unusual responses. Willingness to take those responses seriously rather than dismissing them as irrational. If you feel watched in wilderness, you might be correct. Something might be paying attention to your presence. Something that notices who visits and who returns. I do not know what that something is. I know only that the people who disappeared often felt it during prior visits. They noticed. They felt uneasy. They sensed something different about specific locations. They returned anyway. And one of those returns was their last. Awareness might not prevent disappearances. The mechanism remains unknown. The rules remain unclear. Protection strategies cannot be developed without understanding what we are protecting against. But awareness is better than ignorance. Knowing the pattern is better than not knowing. Having information about elevated risk is better than assuming all visits carry equal odds. The investigation continues. More cases emerge every year. New disappearances fit the profile. Return visitors, prior experiences, equipment arranged, boots placed, trails ending at water. The pattern is not historical. It is ongoing. Whatever takes people has not stopped. I have noticed geographic expansion. Early cases clustered in the Pacific Northwest and Sierra Nevada. Recent cases have appeared in the Ozarks, the Adirondacks, the Florida swamplands. I have also noticed the average number of prior visits before disappearance has decreased. Early cases involved people who visited locations dozens of times over decades. Recent cases include people who disappeared on their third or fourth visit. The threshold may be lowering. People ask me why I devote years to this. The answer is simple. Because the families deserve someone who listens. Because the missing deserve someone who remembers. Because the pattern exists and someone needs to document it. Someday, the accumulated evidence will reveal something I cannot see now. Understanding will emerge from the documentation I am creating. The 13 cases I presented are not anomalies. They are examples. 335 additional cases share the same profile. Harold Mitchell was someone's husband for 41 years. Cameron Hartley was someone's son. Denise Crawford was someone's wife and colleague. Mitchell Reynolds spent 22 years photographing mountain goats. Patricia Warren loved mathematics and mountains. Robert Sullivan understood rock formations. Kevin Reeves climbed because standing on summits made him feel alive. Sandra Powell watched the stars. Thomas Henderson hiked because wilderness brought him closer to something he called God. Rachel Stevens studied mountain lions. Douglas Mercer explored canyons. Lynn Anderson guided others into wilderness. Alan Crawford gave 23 years to protecting Joshua Tree. These were people who understood wilderness, experienced, careful, knowledgeable, and they vanished anyway. Experience does not protect. Knowledge does not shield. The return visitor pattern suggests the very qualities that make someone skilled may increase their risk, because skilled users return, because they come back again and again. The families wait. Years pass. Decades pass. There is no body to bury. There is no explanation. Only absence and questions. I cannot answer those questions. I can only show that they connect, that the profile of the missing is not random, but patterned. I will continue documenting what that something does. Perhaps eventually, someone will understand what it is. The methodology behind this investigation. I began in 2020, focusing on geographic clustering. Disappearances do cluster in certain regions: the Pacific Northwest, the Sierra Nevada, the Appalachians, but the clustering was not specific enough to be useful. I considered temporal and demographic patterns. The data showed wilderness disappearances affected experienced users at higher rates than beginners. This was counterintuitive. People who disappeared tended to have years or decades of experience. This finding led me to the prior visit variable. I restructured my database to track prior visits. The process took 7 months. I reconstructed information from trip logs, permit records, family interviews, social media posts, and trail journals. The result was the 84% correlation. The methodology is imperfect. Some cases lack documentation. Some family members refused interviews. But within the limitations, the pattern is clear. I want to address those watching who have experienced what I describe. You have felt something wrong in wilderness. You sensed a presence. You walked trails where silence pressed against you. You went home and dismissed it as imagination. But you remember it. Years later, you still remember exactly where you were standing. That memory is data. Your experience is evidence. If you sensed something, if a location felt wrong, I want to know about it. Contact information is in the description. To families who have lost someone, I know this information is difficult, but your loved one was not alone. Hundreds share the same circumstances. The disappearance was not a mistake or failure. The risk was in the return itself. Nothing could have been done differently. The pattern operates by rules we do not understand. Your loved one is not forgotten. Every case in my database is a person. I think about them often. Harold Mitchell standing at that creek in morning light. Cameron Hartley laying out climbing gear. Denise Crawford documenting orchids. The evidence suggests willingness. The boots placed carefully. The equipment arranged as if expecting to return. They thought they were coming back. They did not return. But they did not know that when they walked away from their boots. The missing are not numbers. They are Harold Mitchell and Cameron Hartley and Denise Crawford and all the others. They had lives and loves and purposes. They walked into wilderness expecting to walk out again. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to be more than entries in a database. That is why I do this work. Not to frighten people, not to generate views, to remember the people who vanished and to understand why. This is Echo 7. The data is clear. The pattern is real. The warning stands. 347 out of 412. 84%. The first visit is free. The return is where the risk begins. If you have been somewhere that felt wrong, you now have information those 13 people did not have. You know the pattern exists. You know return visits correlate with disappearance at rates that exceed coincidence. Whether you return is your choice. I cannot make that decision for you. I can only tell you what the evidence shows. The investigation continues. If you have information that might contribute, if you have experienced something that fits the profile, I want to hear about it. Even if you came home safely. Especially if you came home safely. Understanding why some people come home and others do not might be the key to understanding the entire pattern. Share this with someone who hikes alone, someone who returns to the same places year after year, someone who has felt something in wilderness they cannot explain. They should know what you know now. The wilderness is vast. The wilderness is beautiful. The wilderness calls to something deep in us that civilization cannot satisfy. But the wilderness is also unknown. The wilderness contains things we do not understand. The wilderness remembers who visits. Go to wilderness. Experience its beauty. Let it restore something in you that the modern world wears away. But pay attention. Notice what you feel. Trust your instincts when they tell you something is wrong. And if you return to a place that made you uneasy, do so with awareness. Do so knowing that return visitors carry risk that first-time visitors do not. 347 out of 412. The number that changed everything. The number that revealed what nobody was looking for. The number that shows us that wilderness is not random in what it takes. That it remembers. That it waits. I do not know what lives in the spaces between the trees. I do not know what watches from the surfaces of still lakes. I do not know what draws people to water and then takes them somewhere we cannot follow. But I know the pattern. I know the evidence. I know what happens to people who feel something wrong and return anyway. Now you know too. The pattern is real. The risk is real. Now you know.